This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include political consultant J. Brad Crone, syndicated columnist and author John Hood, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, and John Locke Foundation's Becki Gray. Well, welcome to this red, white, and blue edition of NC Spin. We've got a lot to talk about this week, including the court case regarding who's in charge of public education. We'll discuss health care legislation in Congress and how it impacts North Carolina. And in addition to that, we're going to be talking about banning people from the legislature. Let's get started. Our Constitution says the State Board of Education shall supervise and administer the public school system in our state, subject to laws enacted by the General Assembly. It goes on to say the Superintendent of Public Instruction shall be the Secretary and Chief Administrative Officer of the board. Last December, in a special session, the legislature attempted to strip the State Board of Education of many of its powers and vest them with the superintendent. But the state board sued to stop the implementation of the law, and this past week the case went before a 3-judge panel. Becki, let's start by asking, initially this case appears to be purely political, but since both the superintendent and the majority of State Board of Education are Republicans, it could get interesting. What's your take on this lawsuit?
It could get very interesting. We've been fighting about this for about 150 years here in North Carolina about who is in charge of our public education, and the fight continues. When you think about it, you've kind of outlined this, but there are different groups that are involved in this, and everybody wants their hand in this. It's the State Board of Education, which is appointed by the governor. It is the Superintendent of Public Instruction that is elected by the voters. And then the General Assembly, as you mentioned, has been very involved in passing laws and statutes of, where that power goes. So this is a fight that, again, it's been going on for 150 years. Maybe it's time for the courts to sort this out, but the fight seems to be really centered on what does the Constitution say, and where does the Constitution lie in who's in charge of public education?
And we revised that Constitution in 1971, even though there have been court cases since then. But the courts have repeatedly, Brad, affirmed the State Board of Education having the authority to set rules and regulations. I guess the question is, if that is the case, then why are we electing a statewide superintendent of public instruction, who is the Secretary and Chief Administrative Officer? Why don't we do what the UNC Board of Governors and the Community College Board do and just appoint the superintendent?
Well, it's a constitutional office on the Council of State. Clearly, it's a turf war. It's, a question of who pees where and who marks their own territory. I mean, that's just basically where we're at. And the governor wants his footprint. The legislature wants their footprint. Becki, you're absolutely right. And, I'm old enough to remember Craig Phillips, and I think it would be back in the days to go back to his type of leadership style. And I think you need to have one central leader to be the cornerstone of the public education system, and I think that person should be the superintendent.
Chris, this lawsuit resulted from this hurriedly passed legislation that was passed without any discussion or debate in December. Was there any justification other than the obvious attempt to limit the powers of incoming Governor Roy Cooper for this?
Yeah, the other justification was to give more power to the incoming Republican State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I don't know what should be the right way to govern our schools, but under the Constitution it's pretty clear. I don't think this is a close call. The Constitution's language is very clear that the state board has the power to run education in North Carolina. The superintendent is the secretary. I've even had some Republican lawyers who wish it was the other way tell me that this is one of the easier cases of all these ones that have been challenged to decide. The General Assembly is doing all they can. They gave Superintendent Johnson more money, more positions. They cut DPI. They went after volunteers for June Atkinson's campaign and fired them. So this has turned into sort of a bitter partisan power struggle. It's fascinating. You mentioned the State Board of Education is Republican. Bill Kobe was the state Republican Party chairman. He is just bound to defend what he believes is the Constitution, which gives the state board that power.
Well, let's talk about that, John, because the different sides of this is Mark Johnson, the superintendent of public instruction, and ultimately the legislature say that they do have the authority to modify the statutes regarding DPI, the superintendent, and the board. The other side of it, Bill Kobe and the board, says the State Board of Education, that the legislature cannot change the intent of the Constitution without a vote of the people. Is this pretty well framing this argument? And if so, which position do you think is the correct one?
More or less. I mean, the key term we need to go back to is administrative. What does it mean to be the chief administrative officer? Because that's the superintendent's constitutional role as secretary, as Chris says, and administrative officer. Is that the same as executive officer? You know, for decades, state superintendents appeared to be executives. They hired staff to run the Department of Public Instruction. That is what the power they thought they had. Now, apparently, we suddenly believe they don't have that power. The State Board of Education has the power. I think it would make more rational sense to invest the power in an appointed board that then turns around and hires a administrative officer or executive officer.
But that's not what the Constitution says.
That's not what we have. So if we're going to elect somebody and call them superintendent, we can't hire anybody to run the DPI. I mean, it's convoluted. The Constitution here is murky.
Becki, most everybody agrees that irrespective of what this three-judge panel says, this case is going to be appealed. You agree?
Yeah, I do. And, you know, it kind of comes back to, I don't know why we're not focusing and asking the question, how can we make this work the best for education, for K-12 students across North Carolina, rather than, you know, I think Brad put, you know, getting into these turf wars. You know, what we need to do is really look at it. How can we organize it? How can we make it work the best to deliver the product that we expect out of
I think
public
the
instruction?
voters are tired of hearing the politicians argue about process. They want results.
Isn't it fascinating, though, that we had a Republican governor appoint a Republican board, and we had a Democratic school superintendent, and they worked very well together, and Bill Kobe be the first one to tell you.
Well, the relationship has always been a little tenuous.
Bill Kobe will tell you that he didn't agree with everything June Atkinson said, but they had a great working relationship, as did the staff of DPI. Now that we have a Republican superintendent, even though we still have a Republican board for a while, they can't get along.
But now, did June Atkinson have the ability? She did. To hire people that she wanted to top jobs? She did. They're still there in many cases.
My understanding was with the consult of the
State Board of Education. That's right. The State Board played a role in that hiring.
Well, what was the precedent with Bobby Etheridge? What was the precedent with Craig Phillips? What was the precedent with other superintendents?
It was a whole lot easier when it was perceived to be all within the same club.
Can we all agree that it is well past time for us to amend the Constitution regarding public education in North Carolina and clearly stipulate who's in charge?
I think that makes a lot of sense, but I am not sure the voters will agree to anything that removes their ability
They've tried
to
it
elect.
before.
Yes, they did.
They rejected that idea before to make the superintendent
Well, the legislature debated the idea of putting a constitutional amendment, but I don't think they ever did.
They did put it on the ballot.
Did they?
We should not be confident the voters will agree to anything that surrenders their power to elect officers. It might be, it'd be a sales job.
Well, here's what I am confident of. You should sign up to receive our free weekly, was that a nice segue? Our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle. It's easy. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. And while you're there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, NCSpin on YouTube, or on Twitter at NCSpinTweets. When we come back, we're going to talk about the proposed health care legislation and how it impacts North Carolina.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
In 2011, our farmers asked for 6,500 seasonal workers. Only 7 Americans showed up to work those jobs. Immigrant farm workers aren't stealing American jobs. To say otherwise ignores the facts. When farmers don't have enough skilled workers, crops go unharvested and farmers lose money. Consumers face fewer choices and higher prices. This is not acceptable. Tell Congress it's time to fix our broken immigration system.
North Carolina has over 300,000 government retirees who depend on their pension. Since the 2008 recession, retirees have seen little or no cost of living increase, while inflation has increased more than 14%. Investing in our retirees is good for the economy. Every pension dollar generates more than $2 for your local economy. Tell your local and state elected official it's time to take care of our retirees and fund a cost of living increase.
Learn more at ncrgea.com.
Many of the 300,000 uninsured in our state are volunteer firefighters, farmers, fishermen, and small business owners. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured.
To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
The big debate over the repeal and replacement of Obamacare has moved to the U.S. Senate, where last week proposed legislation was put on hold until after the July 4th break. North Carolina is going to be greatly affected by changes proposed by either the Senate or the House, and we want our panel to discuss a report released last week showing 1.3 million of our citizens could lose health coverage under the Senate proposal. Brad, let's begin with the discussion about this report. A left-leaning think tank says the Senate plan would result in our state having the fourth highest number of people losing health care coverage. Do you think this report is accurate? And what does it mean if 1.3 million people lose health care coverage?
I think 1.3 million may be stretching it a little bit. You may have 450,000 people on the Affordable Care Act who are directly impacted. You may have the other 900,000 who face rising premiums as a result.
Well, and they're saying Medicare kicks into this too, with some 700,000.
Absolutely.
Medicaid.
So the direct hit to North Carolina on Medicaid is about a $1.5 billion hit starting in 2020. The real question is going to be, will Tillis and Senator Burr, what role will they play? And, North Carolina elected to opt out of Medicaid expansion, yet Alaska and North Carolina are taking the biggest hits when it comes to Medicaid
Virginia.
provisions.
So, Tom, this is absolutely critical. This $1.3 million number is not a stretch, it's idiotic. The people who read the study and then did these front page stories, I can't believe they read even a third of the way down and understood that it assumes two things. Number one, we expand Medicaid, and then it's taken back. So a big chunk of those 1.3 million are people that do not have coverage today. The assumption is they would get it because North Carolina will expand Medicaid, but then the expansion will be nullified by the law. The second problem is another several 100,000 are people who are being compelled to buy now but don't want to, given the costs and the benefits, and they would no longer be compelled to buy. They're not losing health coverage. They no longer have to buy something they don't want.
Well,
at
okay.
the price
You
that's too high.
they all don't want it. Everybody that bought through the exchange doesn't want it.
That's the CBO's
450,000?
the CBO's assumption is that these people are buying it only because of the mandate. If they want it, Chris, then they won't drop it.
Well,
And
they
then
won't be able to
lower
afford-
it.
won't be able to afford it.
Here's
No,
the
that's
impact
not what the
of
argument
that, though. If that customer, if that patient doesn't want it and they drop out, my insurance premiums are going to increase because you're going to have disproportionate share. You're going to
I
have
understand that there are
uncompensated
problems
care.
with adverse selection. My point is the 1.3 million number is ludicrous. It's not debatable. It is ludicrous, and it is a
Well,
scandal that it ever got
Well, a
any
Duke
attention.
researcher went through the whole.
It assumes that hundreds of thousands of people in this number, actually about half of this number, has to do with Medicaid. And the assumption is either that we've expanded Medicaid, which we haven't, or the individual mandate forces people into Medicaid, which it doesn't.
The larger question is this, is that North Carolina made a policy decision not to expand Medicaid, yet we are getting hit with the state of Alaska because we didn't.
And Virginia.
No, we're not.
Don't forget Virginia.
We're not, because it
under the Senate
assumes that
plan-
we did. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
No,
the number that we're fourth highest is only if we expand Medicaid first.
The real numbers on Medicaid reimbursement
You're talking about the
starting in
dollars.
2020
You're talking about the
will go
dollars.
from $13 billion
Dollars.
to $11.5 billion. That's $1.5 billion cuts to our hospitals and our doctors.
But many more states will have much larger cuts because they expanded Medicaid.
All
We
right,
did
so
not.
Becki, is that the reason why this report shows we're among the top 4 states? 10 of the top 20 congressional districts in the country, according to this report, that will lose health care are in North Carolina. Why has our state been so adversely affected?
I think our state was one of the states that had the highest enrollment on Obamacare, so that when you change those parameters there, we would be impacted by that. But I think it's way too early to, as John said, to assume these numbers, to assume all these models are right. I mean, I think we've got a long way to go with that.
But one way or another, though, Chris,
we better assume it pretty soon.
I was getting ready to say, this is really beginning to have some ripple effect in North Carolina as both lawmakers and health officials. And
Well, I can tell you this, the Trump care plan is not going to be as great as the president says it is.
But I think in this whole discussion, we forget, Obamacare wasn't that great. And a lot of people were very unhappy that they lost their doctors, they lost care, and the premiums are where they are.
20-something million people have health insurance now that didn't have it before. President Trump promised during the campaign there will be no cuts to Medicaid.
Everybody would be covered. It would cost less.
And we'll have no cuts to Medicaid.
He made preposterous claims that could not possibly be handled. Absolutely could never happen.
Okay, here's my concern about this whole thing. The Congress and the media is all talking about how are we going to repeal and replace Obamacare, how many people are going to lose health care insurance. The two questions I haven't heard asked is, what do we do in this country to bring down the overall cost of health care? And what do we do to try to help Americans become healthier people? Why isn't this being discussed? Well, that's the big question.
And that's an excellent point, because health insurance and health care are not the same thing. And I think we ought to be focusing on, Tom, as you said, how do we get health care accessible and affordable?
Health care insurance is a post-World War II phenomenon.
The reason we're not talking about it is we haven't had one open hearing in the Senate or the House about this. We should have started talking about this the day after the election and had hearings that are still going on now to figure all those big questions out. That's because this isn't about health care. It isn't about people being healthy. It's about the Republican base fulfilling a promise of the Republican base to say they repealed Obamacare no matter what it does.
Final question. Does anybody at this table honestly believe we're going to get both houses of Congress and the president to agree on a health care repeal and replacement plan before the end of the year?
I still think that is the most likely outcome.
You do?
Yes, because they recognize that if they do not pass a bill through the Congress and get signed by the president, it will be disastrous for them in 2018, because their own base, Republicans who put them into office, will say, we gave you all these different options. We know you don't have a veto or a filibuster-proof majority, but you had a plan, you didn't do it.
I think they understand how perilous it is from a political perspective, and I'll tell you, the only thing they get done is insurance stability.
I think that it is underestimated that Washington can solve this problem. I think where the pressure is going to come is from the American people who want affordable, accessible health care and health insurance that they can afford, with fewer mandates, with being able to buy policies across line and to have choices.
17% of the American people support the Senate plan.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about being banned from the legislature.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
Year after year, fish populations shrink. Fishermen are struggling, and outdated laws make the problem worse. But now, North Carolina legislators have a tremendous opportunity to grow our entire fishing economy, creating nearly 1,500 jobs and $1 billion in economic impact. House Bill 867 will revitalize our entire fishing economy. Tell your legislator to support our coastal fisheries and House Bill 867. Go to www.ncsoundeconomy.com to find out more. Paid for by NC Sound Economy.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
32 people were arrested in the halls of the legislature after they refused to clear the hallways outside legislators' offices at the end of May. Jeffrey Godwin, the Wake County magistrate who heard the case, agreed to release them from jail upon the condition that they be banned from entering the legislature. Chris, we've always thought that, of course, it's a public building, but the legislature is sort of the people's house. Our first question here is whether a magistrate has or should have the authority to ban people from a public building.
Well, I think we're going to find out. I think this case at some point will go to the courts, and you know, there's plenty of ways to punish people or give them a fine or do whatever. But I'm very leery of banning people, as you say, from a public building because they were exercising their rights to protest. If they were arrested, which they were, they didn't protest their arrest. They were arrested. They went to jail. This is part of the tradition of our country. And I think this case will end up in the courts.
John, we had a similar situation in 2013, if you remember, in which some protesters were banned from the legislature. The court overturned that. Do you expect that would be the case here?
Well, the problem here is that if you have someone who repeatedly and consistently violates the rules, you know, not fulfilling the First Amendment right to protest, but going beyond that, for example, occupy offices or obstruct the building or try to shout down the legislators or something. Those are not things people have a right to do. That's why they're being arrested. They're not being arrested for speaking out. They're being arrested for breaking the law. If you basically telegraph, every time I go in there to protest, I'm going to break the law, at some point there's some sort of precautionary action. I'm just not sure magistrates have that authority, though.
Yeah, I'm not either. And I wrote a column about this, and several people wrote me back saying they do have the authority to be able to legislate or to administer verdicts so far as releasing people from jail.
Yeah,
but this is a different.
I mean, basically,
that's a different thing. Banning.
If Reverend Barber had gone in front of whoever and said, every time I go to the legislature, I'm going to do the same thing until they change the law. I mean, at some point, he's just saying, I guarantee you I will break the law. And what's the law's legal system supposed
Brad,
to do?
I guess another question that ought to be asked here is, why didn't the legislators just come out of their offices and talk with these folks and hear what they had to say? Perhaps this could have been dismissed.
Start in the right direction, Tom, clearly. I think John's got a point, though. After repetition, it becomes a tired song. I think you do have the right, but I think as a part of that right, you've got to have a respect for the institution as itself.
And being able to conduct their business.
Exactly. It's a respect for the institution, certainly, but, you know, it's the people's house where the people's business takes place. And there's anybody that's spent any time at the legislature understands, you know, there are things that happen in offices, there's meetings, there's certainly on the floor, there's debate. Members need to be able to hear what's going on. People that work there need to get their work done. You know, I think the magistrate was right.
Well, after these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina has over 300,000 government retirees who depend on their pension. Since the 2008 recession, retirees have seen little or no cost of living increase, while inflation has increased more than 14%. Investing in our retirees is good for the economy. Every pension dollar generates more than $2 for your local economy. Tell your local and state elected official it's time to take care of our retirees and fund a cost of living increase.
Learn more at ncrgea.com.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
North Carolina spends billions on uncompensated medical care every year. To learn how a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured can help your county, visit careforcarolina.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Time for one of our best features on the show when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Becki Gray, I'll start with you.
Tom, one of the issues that got a lot of attention again this session was Certificate of Need repeal. Even in the Senate budget, it had a phase out of Certificate of Need. It did not go through. We did not have Certificate of Need repeal, but I think that we made real inroads with people recognizing the impact that it has on cost, on access, on the quality of care, particularly as we expand mental health facilities and services over the next several years. So I think it's something we're going to continue to talk about. I'm disappointed it didn't happen this session, but it's something that I think the talk will continue.
Chris, tell us something we don't know.
I mentioned earlier that the budget fired some Department of Public Instruction employees who had volunteered for June Atkinson's campaign. The budget also specifically fired a man named Martez Hill, who is the secretary, the chief administrator of the State Board of Education. The secretary does all the work, does all the research. Unbelievably, a personal attack. Bill Kobe is upset about it, and there's no excuse for it.
All right, interesting. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Update to a previous show, Tom, when I expressed some concern about the early economic data for North Carolina in early 2017. I'm feeling a little better now. The most recent job report was much more positive, and the personal income numbers came in pretty good for North Carolina, at least about average or a little bit above average in these measures. So a little bit less concern about our current economic trajectory.
Oh, good. Brad Crone, tell us something we don't know.
Ripple effects coming out of the cuts in the Attorney General's office. District attorneys across the state are very concerned about the impact it's going to have on appellate cases at the Court of Appeals and at the state Supreme Court, in particular on capital cases.
And, of course, that was a $10 million cut.
Substantial.
Attorney General Josh Stein suffered. The governor took $1 million cut. So it'd be interesting to find out how all that's going to play out, but particularly since the veto was overridden this past week. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook, and join us next week when we have a more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed, watch out for the spin, and have a happy and safe 4th.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.